Sometimes I'm surprised by the conversations that pre-adoptive couples have not had. And in the past, I've done a lot of work with pre-adoptive couples in that stage when they're waiting. And there's a lot of anxiousness and a lot of hopefulness. Many of the things that are pointed out in our 10 points here have never been discussed before the child arrives. Especially today when parents of adult children are so young and so active, they don't give the support that people need. And so I encourage people to develop relationships in the community, perhaps through a church or the community, with potential surrogate aunts and uncles for their children.
Well, it sounds like these 10 points are probably useful for anybody in the circle of support.
Yes.
To understand the kinds of challenges with an older and institutionalized child, especially in international adoption. And I think that it's really, what I like about the video is we actually have kind of asked our friends and colleagues to come together and share their practice wisdom.
As an adoptive parent and the director of an agency that handles adoptions, I take the commitment of responsibility to heart. The adoption process may seem overwhelming initially with paperwork, education, and a home study. However, that's just the beginning. The responsibility of commitment runs very deep. It's vitally important that as adoptive parents, we consider whether or not we are absolutely prepared to make this life-changing, forever commitment to a child. The child may end up spending significant portions of time in out-of-home care. How will you handle it if things go very poorly? Will you still maintain the child's best interests in mind? As the adults, we're the decision makers, and everything changes for us as well as for the child that we adopt.
It had taken almost 3 years to finish our adoption, and our children were now much older than we had planned. I had visited them in the orphanage during our adoption and felt like I knew and loved my adopted children. But to be honest, they were much easier to love when they lived at the orphanage and I was not dealing with their behaviors every day. I also figured out pretty quick, I didn't know these children. I had thought of them as mine for 3 years. I thought about ending the adoption process because I could see that I was in over my head. But I also knew that I had committed to these children to be their permanent family forever. Their behaviors challenged us a lot, and currently the older child is in a residential facility. We are still his family, but family sure looks different than I'd ever expected. It now involves the possibility of visits only every few months and limited phone calls. But in spite of these problems, they're still my children, and I will stay committed to doing my best to parent them no matter how much they push me away.
As an adoption professional, obviously I think families must take their commitment to their adopted children seriously. At the same time, I've also seen that some families know almost from the beginning that they are in over their head, but they drag out things primarily because they do not want to be judged by others. They do not pursue the help and assistance they need, and they try to make the child fit their definition of who that child should be, even when it is clear that it is not realistic. If a family is not going to really dive in, secure the resources they need, and do the very hard work of parenting a traumatized child, they should look at dissolving their adoption earlier. It is not good for a child to only be a minimal part of the family, only to have the family decide years down the road that they no longer want to parent. If you aren't going to do everything in your power and dedicate your whole heart, then dissolve the adoption earlier rather than later. Let me give you a case example. About a year ago, I spoke with a family who had adopted a 7-year-old boy from an institution setting overseas just a few months before. Within a few conversations, it was obvious that the adoptive parents did not really like the child and certainly did not love him. They were very concerned and bothered about what other people would think of them if they were to decide they were not able to parent the child, but their concern rested more with image than with the effect the decision would have on the child. This was a family who was not originally well suited for an older and institutionalized child. No one had adequately informed them of the challenges and risks. They have now dissolved their adoption, which I think ultimately is better for this particular child. They should have decided this more than a year ago when the writing was on the wall, and this little boy could have transitioned earlier to a permanent family willing to fully commit to him come whatever.
Working in adoption, I've heard parents say things such as, "This is not rewarding. I don't like parenting this child," or "I thought that this child would blend in immediately upon joining the family. This child's in my personal space. He or she's embarrassing." The idea that children merely need a safe and loving, warm family to live in is a mistaken notion when it comes to deinstitutionalized children. Parents adopting older children from orphanages need to be prepared to be unloved, to work hard, and to essentially receive no reward for this parenting other than the intrinsic satisfaction of knowing that you've made a difference in the life of a child. Oftentimes, adoptive families have fantasized notions about how this child will respond. They have the idea that the child will be grateful for having been rescued from living in an orphanage. However, many children don't fit this idea. They may not want to leave their friends within the orphanage. They may not want to leave the only home that they've ever known. They may still harbor ideas of being reunited with their biological family members.
There's certain things that you're not really prepared for.
Our agency never prepared us for the severe trauma the children suffered. In the 2.5 years they've been with us, they've lied, cheated, stolen, threatened our other 2 children, forged our names, destroyed property. They've used inappropriate body language around the opposite sex, and they've displayed fits of rage and anger. They have either not taken responsibility for their actions, they've lied, or they've blamed others.
Adopting an institutionalized child is a great deal of hard work, and families must be prepared to adjust their expectations to what a child may actually be capable of. It's not realistic to expect that an institutionalized child will get along with other children in the home or school. It's not realistic to expect that the post-institutionalized child will love the adopted family or even accept their role as parents. The child likely has no idea what a family means. These are often seriously disturbed children, and families often seem to be in denial about the challenges of parenting a child who has experienced institutionalization.
Children who have been institutionalized for a significant portion of their lives exhibit different behavior than children who grew up in nuclear families. But when they transition to your home, you need to be careful and be aware of helping them to understand what is appropriate behavior on their part and on the part of others.
Other institutionalized behaviors may include rocking, headbanging, and other repetitive motions. These are not only common, but may actually have biology as their root, as we must remember that these children must often self-soothe, and so rocking may be a form of actually pretending to rock themselves, much as a mother would rock them.
One of the ways that a child learns to survive in a large group setting is to develop a heightened sense of self-protection.
The culture that he grew up in, the attitudes that he was exposed to, formed him in a way that by the time he came to us just after turning 11 have been a real challenge. We don't know if he will ever really be able to trust us. Not that he distrusts us, but he doesn't trust circumstances.
What may seem like a heightened sense of selfishness in a child might just possibly be something they've learned within the group and was completely acceptable where they were, each child making sure that they got their fair share. They definitely will at times seem to be inordinately manipulative when dealing with you and when dealing with the other children in your family.
Our children came home each with a different set of social skills. Our younger child, who came home at 7 years old, is now 13, still struggles greatly with social skills. He came home with virtually none. He knew to hug everyone he saw, try to be cute, and maybe somebody would give him some candy or some attention. That works for a while with adults, but it gets old. When he was about 11, he was still trying to hug and touch others, even the boys at school. I started placing him in timeout whenever he would touch another person. It got his attention, and within a couple of weeks the behavior was extinguished. He also still does things that are labeled annoying, even by the teachers. If something is funny one time, he will repeat it over and over. We have to role play and use other strategies, but his social skills remain very delayed, and we have seen little progress. Our oldest child, adopted at age 10, was masterfully manipulative. Like a chameleon, she can read people and within minutes become exactly the image that will be pleasing to whomever she is with. She can lie with a straight face and you will actually second guess yourself. She gets everyone to be against each other. She has lied about me to anyone who will listen and actually had me investigated for child abuse. She has an extremely strong personality and is very strong-willed. Survival traits from the orphanage living, I'm sure, but this has created havoc in our home. She goes for whatever she wants and will stop at nothing to get it. I have found knives in her room and she has stolen numerous things from me. I think I take the brunt of her anger because she is still so mad at her biological mother for the abuse, neglect, and abandonment. So she takes these feelings out on me. Trying to parent her has been the hardest thing I have ever done. Children who grow in nuclear families learn how to interact appropriately within the culture first by modeling by the family, their parents, their siblings, the extended family, and then secondly by the existing within the community at large. Children who live in institutions do not have good models of behavior. Their primary models are actually other institutionalized children, and they likely have been victims of all kinds of problems such as abuse and neglect. Additionally, for international adoption, the challenge of learning appropriate interaction is compounded by cultural differences. This can be very frustrating for everyone, both for the child and for the adoptive family.
Mealtimes vary from families to families. They also vary from institution to institution in children's homes. But one thing you can be sure of, that within a children's home, there will be large tables with large groups of children eating together. The way in which children actually eat or even pass their food is a social and a learned behavior. If they've been within an institution for any length of time, they have learned to behave according to the norms and practices of that particular place. Whatever a child's experience was within that institution, it was not the experience of a child in a nuclear family. Expect time for adjustment. Also, though, a child may feel a sense of a need to hoard or a need to make sure that they get the food that they really feel they need. Scarcity in their lives may well have produced a sense of urgency when it comes to eating. Quickly trying to adjust a child to your family's norm around the dinner table may cause a trauma or unnecessary conflict in the first few weeks or months that the child is with you.
I remember the first time my daughter, adopted from an orphanage in Haiti, actually threw food away. Of course, I don't encourage my kids to waste food, but she always finished everything on her plate, and everyone else's plate too. We were at Wendy's and had hamburgers and fries, and before all her fries were gone, she said, "Mama, I'm full." I was so happy she actually figured out how it felt to be full. Many children who have lived in an environment, whether an institution or the biological family, where there is inconsistent food supply have experienced that they must eat all the available food until it's gone. When a child joins a family where there is food in plentiful amounts, some adoptive parents express that excessive overeating, even to the point of vomiting, is not unusual. Permitting frequent snacks and preparing dinner plates in advance rather than serving everyone family style can sometimes create a less stressful mealtime. But usually time and consistent availability of food that the child comes to trust will eventually lead to a belief that they will not starve in the adoptive home.
The reality of living with an attachment disorder child cannot be comprehended until one has lived through it. Attachment happens as a cycle of need. An infant gets upset, red in the face, they start crying, and then mom is supposed to come and meet that infant's needs. Once the need is met, then the child starts to relax, and the mom should be with the child in this relaxation, and this is actually when attachment and bonding are typically occurring. When this happens repeatedly, an infant learns trust. With children who have been institutionalized, very often this trust has never been established. The child was allowed to cry or never had their needs met. You might go into a children's home and all of the children in the baby room are quiet. This is largely because their needs have not been met. So they have learned that agitation and crying do them no good. This starts to create attachment disorders and attachment difficulty. Families residing with children with attachment disorder are often overwhelmed, emotionally exhausted, financially drained, and just overall at the end of the rope. It's different to parent a child that's attachment disordered than it is to parent a biological child or to parent a child that doesn't have attachment difficulties. This creates a great deal of tension and strain for the parents.
As much over 8 months that we thought he was making great strides, there'll be these moments when you can just see that he goes to a very dark place. He loses any investment that we may have been building with him, of investment in our little family structure, but more importantly in himself.
Even though an attachment disorder child may want the love of a family, he or she has never learned to receive this love, and he or she has never learned to trust, which creates such an inherent conflict. Therefore, the child may very well be trying to reject the parent repeatedly in order to push the parent so far that the parent will also reject them, thereby ensuring that the child's view of the world is accurate and that their view of themselves is accurate, which is of themselves as an unlovable and unworthy human being.
Parenting a child with radical attachment disorder is pure hell, plain and simple. My daughter hates me and is manipulative in all her interactions with me. She has never let me really see who she really is, and she emotionally pushes and pulls me all the time. If I start to get close, she pushes away to make sure she can reject me first. She wants to control everything and everyone. If I need to run a quick errand after I pick her up from school, it sends her into a tizzy. This was not something she planned into her day. I get so tired of everything being a battle. She can never relax and just trust. I've read all about fight and flight response, and I try to understand what she's going through. But that does not make it any easier to deal with, especially when I'm tired and I just need a break, which I never get. When I'm exhausted, that is when she notches up her behavior. It feels like she preys on my emotions and seeks to control even how I feel. I spend a great deal of time feeling guilty because I cannot seem to break through all the trauma she experienced to get her to trust me.
Putting myself in their place, a lot of their reactions are very reasonable. They have a great need to establish friendship, to feel accepted, to feel loved, but they have never built trusting relationships. They like relationships to be very sweet and very pretty on the outside and hollow on the inside because they've had a tough time establishing relationships of trust.
Families must recognize that they will be exhausted from trying to connect with an emotionally damaged and attachment disordered child. They must have the resources in place and a plan in place for how they will help that child to heal from the multiple levels of trauma that they've had and the fact that they've never learned to trust. This plan should be in place before they adopt. When considering an adoption, it's important that families consider their own attachment needs and styles. We ourselves may even have attachment issues that need to be addressed. Going back to the expectation part of this video, there's a fantasized notion that we may immediately attach to our child. And this is also played out in many Hallmark movies and other things that seem to show that a family immediately falls in love and bonds with the child that is placed with them for adoption. However, this simply isn't the case. Families or individuals who like to play and whose attachment style is more playful and it's done more through activity may find that an older adoptive child is just the right adoptive placement for them. However, individuals who attach more through nurturing activities and who through being needed may find that adopting an older child who is past the infant and toddler stage of needing someone to constantly be around and hover over them may find that adopting an older child is setting them up for failure and that they are not able to attach to that child.
My adopted children came home at an older age with personalities already developed and certainly not needing the nurturing that is needed with infants or toddlers. I had great trouble attaching to them, and my attachment to them is not as strong as to my biological children. I found that when my children were sick or had been picked on at school, this was an opportunity for me to feel needed and for me to attach to them. I do believe some people fall instantly in love, but I think that is the exception rather than the rule. I also think that there is a combination between both the attachment style of the parent and the child. A child who is busy rejecting a parent's love is very hard to attach to, especially when the parent is not prepared for this rejection. I felt either smothered or rejected all the time. The kids were either climbing all over me, demanding my full attention away from anything and everything else, or they were turning their backs on me, actively disobeying, and pulling away from a pat on the back or a hug.
This is a difficult area and not something that's comfortable to talk about. However, families that adopt children from orphanages should assume that their child has had some level of sexual exposure. Families must remember that these children are spending their nights in large rooms with multiple beds with little adult supervision. It's quite possible that they have been exposed to the sexual acting out of another child, or that they have even been abused by another child or an adult.
Within a children's home context, the likelihood of a child being sexually active, whether it's a level of curiosity or out-and-out abuse, is very high. Sometimes it's simply the matter of the ratio of caregiver to child is just not adequate enough to really watch the children at all times. But even when there is an adequate ratio, even when there's adequate planning in the construction of the facility, and even when there's constant vigilance, we need to recognize that some of the children coming into a children's home have been sexually abused prior to their arrival.
As such, post-institutionalized children often have a much more sophisticated level of knowledge and behaviors. This strikes at the very deepest core of most parents' and families' fears and embarrassment. A post-institutionalized child may enter the home and engage in sexualized play, perhaps even leading the other children within the family within these types of fantasies and sexual play.
The experts show that a child who has been abused will persist in abusive behavior even after being removed from the situation.
Our daughter came into our home sexually reactive, and about a year later we discovered that the institution actually had documentation in our file about her perpetuating sexual acts with other children, both male and female. Within a couple of months in our home, she was caught engaging our children in sexual behaviors. She also tried to repeatedly have sexualized contact with my husband and any other adult males who were near. She had obviously been seriously sexually abused from a young age. I felt so sad for what she had been through, but I also felt terribly guilty that I had now exposed my other children to inappropriate sexual behaviors. I worried that children at her school and our church would also be in danger. We had to change everything in our home to keep our children safe. No one could be alone with another child without a parent present. Everyone had to have their own individual blankets when watching TV, and hands had to be on top of the blankets. Our lives were so regimented and structured toward safety, it was very unnatural, and there was a constant state of anxiety within our home.
This is extremely difficult for families to confront and for them to accept, as they did not enter into an adoption typically assuming that sexual assault or sexual abuse would be a part of the history of the child that they adopted. However, it is so often the reality that it's vital that families understand that this could be a likely situation.
As an adoption social worker, I often know of the worst case scenarios. This one involves a sibling group from an Eastern European institution, and there's some important lessons. The children joined a family with existing biological children in a similar age range. Social history records on the adopted children did not include a history of sexual abuse. Sadly, the oldest of the adopted children violently perpetrated sexual abuse on the younger children at night while their parents slept. This went on for months before it was discovered, and the victims had been severely threatened against telling their parents. Although extensive family therapy was pursued, the adoption of the oldest child ultimately disrupted. This is not a particularly unlikely scenario, unfortunately. For this reason, some agencies rarely approve out-of-birth order adoptions. I think families need to be prepared for the very worst case and have a strong plan in place of how they handle crisis if and when the worst case presents.
parent may need to incorporate new parenting skills and strategies. This can be quite disruptive for the other children within the family also, as oftentimes it seems as if the adopted child is being treated differently. There are different strategies that will work with an adopted child, and particularly an older adopted child who may be developmentally delayed or may have other disorders or issues, as we're talking about in this video, that are not necessarily the same approach that would be useful for a biological child who doesn't have those issues. The children within the family definitely pick up on the differences in treatment between the biological children and the adopted children, and this often creates the idea that everything is unfair and that one child or other children are being favored, or that more time and attention is being paid to one or another child within the family. Because of the stress and difficulty within the family system, this may require professional intervention, and it certainly requires a great deal of patience for all members of the family to help the attachment disordered child with their progress and with their healing.
This is such an enormous issue for our family. A child who has not consistently received love, affection, and nurturance does not approach family life in the same way. They do not have confidence in the love that is shown to them. Because of this, the disciplinary tactics must be handled vastly differently. For my biological son, if I become frustrated, fuss at him, and send him to his room, he knows I still love him. But if I react this way to my adopted son, he figures that he is getting permanently rejected, and all the love and nurturance I have provided seems to wash away, and I have to start all over. The other children notice this. They notice the different parenting styles and believe that the adopted son has it easier or is somehow more loved.
I think our other children have been traumatized by this adoption. They have seen and experienced things they never should have. I made a mistake thinking I could save the world, and our children are paying the price. We should have waited until our other children were much older, but I thought I knew better. I thought I knew the kids, and I thought it was the right thing to do. I failed at my first responsibility to protect the children I already had been blessed with. If I could go back in time, I would not do this adoption over again. Doctors and therapists are helpful, but her issues are affecting the other children and our marriage. We feel taxed and overwhelmed, even though progress is being made.
Marriage takes a lot of work, and on any given day there are new challenges that people may not have been prepared for. And in working with families for over 40 years now, both in pre- and post-adoptive states, we find that problems that may not have surfaced as early in the relationship are brought out by the stress of the new family member. Another thing that happens often is people are expecting their family system, their family of origin, to be supportive and to be behind them, to stick with them. And it's, in one way, it's something, the way families respond to grief, that in the acute stage of grief, people are around and then they go away and families are on their own. Often adoptive families feel the same way. Where did everyone go? Where are those visits that we were getting and the supportive phone calls? Where's the interest level? And fathers and moms have to really stick together and really be on each other's side as team members. They need to also have plans to get away from the kids and have one-on-one time with one another and do some of the things they've always found that keeps their marriage strong, not lose sight of that primary relationship between husband and wife. It will be extremely helpful for people to plan ahead and think ahead, develop some strategies for problem solving, but more probably importantly is to develop a support system and really ask people openly, are you willing to hang in there with us? Are you willing to provide some babysitting? Are you willing to provide some times that maybe the husbands can get together and husbands make it possible for the moms to get together and the wives to get together, to have that personal support that people need, and especially when there's stress in the family.
My husband and I have divorced largely because of the impact of parenting deeply disturbed older children. They enter the home with manipulative skills far exceeding anything any of us could have expected. They lied to my husband about me and were constantly seeking ways to undermine our relationship. It was next to impossible for my husband and me to agree on how to parent them. I wish that in the beginning we had a plan in place for how to address some of the issues that I now know are common in older child adoptions. Instead, we let it rip an otherwise strong and happy marriage apart. And to be frank, our adopted children could not be happier about the chaos that they were able to cause. It's very common for the primary caregiver to be on the receiving end of the most negative behaviors of an older post-institutionalized child. And very often, the other parent does not recognize the extent of the issues that the primary caregiver deals with on a day-to-day basis. One of the most destructive things for a family is for one parent to feel undermined or not heard. I worked with a family recently that was struggling with an adopted 6-year-old child. The family could not articulate what exactly concerned them, or the truth be told, as it seemed the issue was related more to the adoptive mother than anything about the child. The child was placed with an experienced foster family for some respite care. And within a day, this foster family called with a number of concerns about the child, specifically attachment disorder and sexual reactivity. Upon further conversations with the adoptive parents, it was apparent that the adoptive mother had indeed been noticing the very issues that were obvious for experienced foster parents. But her perspective was negated by her husband when he told her that the child behavior was normal and to be expected. Upon learning that the behaviors of the child were problematic, the husband became very remorseful and actually apologized profusely to his wife. The best advice I can give parents is to support each other's role and perspective. Do not dismiss the concerns of one parent. This negates the truth of that parent's experience and only serves to harm the relationship. This often grows into resentment, and the one parent whose reality is diminished may end up feeling crazy or unsafe emotionally to share what is really happening in the home. I urge couples to reflect back on what they love about their spouse before the adoption and to consider whether or not they thought their spouse was overly dramatic or prone to exaggeration before the addition of a post-institutionalized child. If these things were not true before, then why are they now considered to be an accurate reflection of your spouse? Really important points about social support and the need to connect with other families that can identify with your experience as you integrate an older and adopted child. But also there are other families that haven't adopted but are just really interested in helping out and being there as a support to you. So those are your informal resources. I'm kind of thinking also about what some of the formal resources are, like local social services such as counselors who are really knowledgeable about children who've had experiences either in foster care or institutionalized children. What are some of your other thoughts, Mike?
There are doctors, dentists, church leaders, community leaders that have a special interest and heart for adoptive families. Probably it's been close to their home somewhere, some way, their own personal experience, and they have an interest and knowledge. And you can seek them out, and there's a real network out there.
I really like the idea of bringing out the pediatrician, actually, because there are actually pediatricians now that specialize in adoption, sometimes at the university,
Yes.
medical centers, or in other kinds of practices, and quite often some of them are even adoptive parents themselves, and
Exactly.
they are really important to understanding some of the health issues. And sometimes kids come from locations in which maybe they have TB, and all of a sudden we have to work up very quickly to deal with that, or other kinds of issues that are kind of known to a particular country. And so I think the pediatrician relationship is really important.
It's essential. There's also foundations available to help with medical expenses for children that need surgeries and need medical care. Families often don't know they can afford to do an adoption, so having the understanding of the resources, that there's actually some financial aid available through foundations and private sector resources can encourage people that otherwise might think that they can't step up and become an adoptive parent.
And of course, there's a lot of self-help on the internet, a lot
Right.
of places to go and learn about a particular condition, or even to get online and chat with other families if you don't have something in your local community.
Yes.
And there's a whole array of books and other kind of serve your purposes as you need kind of resources. Sometimes it's just kind of that spare time of reading, the opportunity to look at what other families have experienced.
There's a lot of information out there, and really a lot of available resources that once you open that door, you'll get connected, and it's very encouraging to people. And even if the family system hasn't stayed with them, other people will. And it's out there for them if they really will look for it. And that's why we as social workers can be helpful, to encourage them to take that look or to do some of the research for them in the beginning days to get the ball rolling.
I actually see this as pre-adoption homework. What are the resources? It literally open the yellow pages. What kinds of things are out there? Talk with folks that have adopted, find out who the counselors are that are known for working really well with families and children, and create that list before you ever need it. So Mike, I feel like this top 10 list that we created was really important just from the perspective of social workers, especially after seeing kind of almost the scandals that we've seen in the press about older children being adopted internationally and families not always coping well or having difficulties. And we thought through this list. What are your thoughts now that we look at our top 10?
I think they're right on target, and I think that a lot of the issues in our top 10 are really encountered by most of the families that I work with in my private counseling.
And we didn't really create the list to scare people. And some people might think this is scare tactic work. It really isn't. It's about being realistic and honest with yourself and ready as a couple, ready as a family.